So, welcome to the podcast, Death, a Changing Industry. Today, we have the great pleasure to welcome Deborah Leek Bailey, OBE, to talk about all things bereavement awareness, how this plays a part in the school education system and also in society. So, we'll go straight over to Deborah now. And Deborah, firstly, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. And before I go into my questions, would you mind just giving us a bit of background on yourself and how you got involved in this area of expertise, please?
Sure. I'm formerly a teacher, and then I became a senior leader in the state sector, and I've worked in both state and independent schools, and I became a head teacher. And whilst I was a head teacher, and indeed throughout my career, I've obviously been aware of children who've experienced death within their families, and close sort of family relations, and the impact that it can have if it's dealt with badly as well as if it's dealt with well, and those longer term outcomes, and trying to make children more resilient and being able to work through their trauma is, I think, really important. And most people, in fact, very few people, um, go into teaching for any other reason that they want to make a difference. And sometimes there are external factors beyond our control. And it became very evident to me when I was witnessing young people experiencing death in that way that there were things we could do to make their life easier. And part of that was around planning. But also, I became a government advisor after headship, and I worked on a lot of independent state school partnership projects and social mobility. And I did some work with the RAF and the MOD. And in all of those instances, people would discuss with me loss and grief and how it forever changes people. And there was a common thread about, you'll get over it. I hope you'll get over it. And sort of thinking, well, actually, you never ever get over it. You learn to live with it. So that kind of had me thinking. And one of my close friends was a family liaison officer with the police. And she worked at Child Bereavement UK, and she often spoke about the projects they were doing and how they were launching into schools. And so what we then did was we piloted with the charity some sort of school hub work, and we identified kind of cold spots. And because of the work I was doing with the DFE at the time, it made sense that we'd look at areas of deprivation and how, if you're a child living in an area of deprivation, you've obviously got things stacked against you to begin with. But if you then experience grief, then your outcomes are significantly diminished. And how we eradicate that became a really burning desire for me. And so I spent quite a bit of time liaising with Child Bereavement UK, and they asked me to come on board and become a trustee. So I did that for, I think it was about 5 years. And I'm now working for a global charity education development trust, and I'm their director of schools. So again, I'm back hearing all those stories. And one of the first things that I said when I worked with my designated safeguarding leads in the schools, we set up a group and of deputy DSLs and DSLs, and we talked about grief and death and naming it as death, calling it out, and how teachers, because they want to make young people feel as secure and safe as possible, sometimes can soften the messages around something which is really very, very tough for everyone to deal with, but particularly the person at the centre of that, the child. And so Child Bereavement UK asked me, when I could no longer, because all the other things I was doing, be a trustee, they said, would I still be prepared to be their education advisor? So my connection with a charity that I feel is so important at signposting things to others is quite long-standing. And In my career, as I say, I've seen death and bereavement dealt with very, very well by schools. And in some instances, when I think back to my early career and even my involvement in it, sometimes not quite so well. And we learn by our mistakes, hopefully. So as I've gone along the way, I've talked to teachers about what I think works, but I've also listened to the things that they've said to me they have struggled with when they've, experienced death within their own families, say, and then it's brought back to life in a very vivid way when they're trying to support others. And the responsibility we have in the education sector to also support teachers. And one of the first things I think about that is ensuring that they're well prepared and well informed and they know where to go for support themselves when they're trying to support others.
Yeah, no, well, thank you so much for that insight into the work that you have done and continue to do. I agree with my involvement at Child Bereavement UK. They are a very special charity and organisation. Um, so yeah, just a huge thank you for all that you're doing. So you and I have spoken prior to this meeting today, and this talk today about the importance of proactive conversations rather than reactive conversations. And you've got a vast amount of experience in talking to different heads of schools about their experiences. Could you expand further on the differences and why you think proactive is the way to go rather than reactive? And we spoke about policies as well. Could you give some insight into your views around that, please?
I think what happens is that whenever um, an incident of death occurs, whether it be something outside of school that then is brought into school, or it can be the tragic death of a child, a death of a member of staff, but um, it triggers inevitably emotions in all of us because most of us are empathetic beings. We want to support others. We feel bad for them for that sense of loss they experience. And therefore, we also must acknowledge we're in some kind of emotional state, even if we are professional beings who have that veneer of being in control. And so, therefore, when an incident occurs, I believe it is much better to be prepared by having a policy that everybody's familiar with. And they might not know it off by heart, but they certainly know where to go to access it. And what they also do is they have that security of knowing that there is an agreed protocol in terms of the way one needs to behave in those circumstances. And so even even the best policy, let's not make any mistake about it, on the day, at the time, you will deviate slightly from it. But that's because your circumstances are always going to be slightly different. And there is no blanket way to address every situation where death and grief are concerned. But what I've certainly found is that in the schools where they've had policies in place, staff know that there is somebody who's going to be the designated lead in relation to communicating messaging. It avoids families having lots of people trying to do well and contact them to let them know their concern, and the poor families then having to relive telling their story because the school has agreed who it will be and what the contact will be. And it's things like the information we provide to the pupils, to the teachers. It's about making sure that other families, if there's been a pupil who's experienced death within their own family, then their peer group are going to be very aware of that. And it's about the messaging around it and with the best will in the world, children are at school all day long, but they go home to other people. And so keeping those other people informed, but also in a way that's respectful to the family dealing with their grief. And so touching base with the family and ensuring the messaging meets with their approval. They're all things that mean when we're lurching through this crisis of sadness, inevitably, in most instances, that's the prevalent thing people feel, is a huge sense of um, sort of sympathy and empathy, concern for those that are undergoing the situation, but also making sure we do it right, that we don't
Yeah.
become indulgent with our own sense of whatever loss we've experienced too. And I found that keeping people in the loop, giving them factual information very frequently is really important. And especially children, because children have this wonderful imagination. And so if you don't tell them things, their brain will go into overdrive, making up the possibilities, which could be endless. And so you're protecting the family, you're protecting the person who's died and their memory, and being respectful to the way they would want to be treated. And of course there are also cultural differences as well, and plays a major part, because in some cultures it's not necessarily prevalent for them to be talking very openly about death and discussing and exhibiting extreme sadness, but it doesn't mean they're not feeling those things. And so being mindful about what's appropriate at the right time. And I found that even if I didn't have anything that I had been updated on, I would let people know that too,
Yeah.
because then it wasn't a case of them thinking everyone knew something they didn't, and not knowing how to react to a situation. So, they are the reasons. And I will share with you that when I was a young teacher, and this would be an indication of my age, but when I was a young teacher, there was the tragic situation of the Zeebrugge ferry disaster. And it was where the ferry had left its lower deck open and the water came in, and many, many people died on that trip that was meant to obviously be a fantastic trip overseas. And I was teaching one of the children of the victims of that tragedy. And I'd only been teaching about a year and a half, I think. And but they were, I remember very clearly in my English and drama class, and the child had come to school that morning, very vibrant personality, gone home that night to the empty house. And then, of course, the police starting to make the connections and inform people. But that girl came to school with parents and went home without them and never
Mm.
had them again. And I just look back on that situation and I know for sure that the school could have done more to support that child.
Yeah.
And that really makes me sad to think that as a young teacher, what I was being told was, oh, don't make a fuss. And you could see that child was crying out for somebody to just say, are you okay?
Yeah.
What can we do for you? What do you want? And I think we've come a long way as teachers since then. I certainly hope so. But um, I know that there are still schools where they wait for things to happen, and are reactive in the way your question implied.
Mm.
And I think if we can be proactive, don't we owe that to the people who are experiencing such extreme pain in their lives? And it's the least we can do, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's if we can have these conversations which will affect us all, um And there's lots to unpick there, what you've just said. Firstly, about the one size does not fit all, which is so correct. But having that policy in place, just a go-to, is really, really helpful. It's a starting point. Um, but also as well, like having these conversations at a younger age, having that awareness within the schools, like you said, that person that you looked after, and that experience that you went through, is missed opportunities. That's what I find terribly sad, because the whole
Yeah,
experience can be so much better. And then the outcome and the community is together and can actually have some tools, simple tools, and knowing how to talk and help. Um, what's interesting as well is that, you know, if we can have some tools given to us at a young age to see us through to adulthood, there's people that you and I will both know who would prefer to cross the street, not prefer to, but have to cross the street because they're not sure what to say.
yeah.
So actually, having some basic tools again, which we can give the young people, and have being around it at a young age, can really have an impact on society. So with that, then we have, following the petition last year, which finished in April. The Department for Education will, we have down for the end of February this year, 2024, carry out the consultation to add content on deaf, dying, and bereavement into the national curriculum as part of their um, consultation to look at that. Um, I think we have a real opportunity to really help society come together and have more compassion in society, and more awareness and more care and kindness and better communication. What are your thoughts? Do you see any dangers with this, or do you think it will help, and then it will lead on to that policy that you've spoken about so well too?
I think it's very important to have something embedded into the curriculum because for many children, there's a sort of this mystical association with death. There's a sense that it's the unknown, it's
Mm.
scary, but we know as adults that it is inevitable. And it may start with their pet dying. And, I know that my husband said to me when he was younger, they were looking after a neighbour's budgerigar, and it flew out of the cage, and unfortunately it died. And so what they did was they replaced it, hoping the person wouldn't notice.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it wasn't the right colour tone, and the person did notice. And I sort of thought to myself, it's really fascinating because we try and fix things, don't we? Where, that's what we do. And um, sometimes you can't fix something. What you can do is acknowledge it's happened. If a child experiences a death, then whether that be a grandparent or a parent, sibling, very close friend, um, what happens is we can't change the fact that's happened, but by being more aware, by helping young people to be more aware that they can go through a variety of different reactions, for example, and that they may very well experience disbelief. They may, they can likely feel angry that it has happened, and why has it happened? It's not fair. They may feel very sad. And some of them will inevitably be feeling, if there's a loss within a class, they'll feel all those things at different times. It won't,
Mm.
we don't go in this linear kind of process in regards to grief. And so I think even for young people themselves to understand that their best friend, who they thought really liked pupil A, and pupil A has died, just because they're not crying every 5 minutes doesn't mean to say they're not hurting
Mm.
terribly.
Yeah.
And so I think managing peer group pressure is reduced when you include something in the curriculum. It needs to be dealt with sensitively. And when you say about drawbacks, yes, I can think from first-hand experience of one of my family members who I love dearly, lost her dad aged 10, and well, in fact, just going into senior school. And it happened in the June. And I know, it's devastating for us as a family. But to watch somebody that you love very much experiencing that kind of acute pain, um, we notified the school, her mum notified the school, and it was a new school, so she's going into a brand new situation. And certain aspects of that were handled very well. And they did have bereavement as part of their curriculum for PSHE. And what happened was they flagged up to her mum that it was going to occur, and then she was given the option of whether or not she would attend. So that I think is great that something like that could happen. You know, I could tell you instances where it didn't happen so well, but I think that it's about making sure that if someone has an option not to attend, that you think what's going to happen to them, because they're going
Mm.
to think about it. They're going to know they're not in that room for a reason. What other material are you going to do with them? Don't just leave them on their own to read a book or do their
Yeah.
homework, you know, think about those things. But I think educationally, we need to educate around death and grief and traumatic loss and resilience, and how, in all those instances, if we know that it's part of a life cycle and that it's a privilege to be alive, and what we do with our lives for however long we're on this planet, that's really important, you know, and that when people who we love are no longer physically with us, we can carry them around in our heart and in our memories, and we can create memory boxes, or, you know, different people have different ways of remembering the people they love. But talking about it, and talking about it with your classmates, and if you're much younger, you know, teachers finding ways through picture and story, and physical activity to help youngsters understand those things, that I think it shouldn't be optional. That that's education, isn't it? We're educating youngsters for life.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think, like you say, the having that choice is really important to opt in or opt out, especially if you've recently had a loss. But educating the class friends is equally as important to sort of have that compassion throughout. The loss of my mum when I was 12, I know it firsthand that you can feel so isolated because you feel like nobody else knows what you're going through. And actually, you just get on with it. And it's not a case of, it's not a sob story. You just get on with things. But actually, as we said right at the start, this whole journey and period in time, which is difficult, can be so much better than what a lot of schools have in place at the moment. Um, and again, I think the key part of this as well is age appropriate. That's the critical wording to use. So, depending on on that sort of school age, the material is changed accordingly.
Yeah, don't
So
you also think though, John, it's about the fact we know, like I'm a parent, you know, I know that our children require structure. And I remember as a child myself, which parent I would go to get the answer I wanted from, you
yeah,
know, I'm very privileged. I've still got both my mum and dad alive. Um, but I also kind of know, because of the age they are, I'm not going to have them around for that much longer. But I hope it's for forever. But, you know,
mm,
it's that knowledge that you have as an adult. But I think as a child, what happens, and as a young person at school, um, that and university, that we we know that people require structure, and that in embedding in the curriculum and in policies a format that people can follow, that's tried and tested and has proven to be successful, then surely all of us would want that. And certainly as a parent, I would hope that those things were being addressed in school, because none of us are experts on our own. It doesn't
No.
matter what we do as for a living. And the more help and the more openness, the more transparency there is around grief, the better we are at cracking how to actually deal with it when it impacts on us personally, I think.
Yeah, I think yeah, I totally agree. And also, like you say, your parents won't be here forever. It gives us an understanding and appreciation that our loved ones aren't here forever. I arrange funerals for people, families, individuals who could be in their 60s, arranging a funeral for their parents, and they never considered that it's like a denial almost, but the awareness that their mums or dads might die one day when they're in our care, they are they're totally overwhelmed, quite in a state of fear almost. And I'm not saying we can remove sadness from loss, but just having some awareness. So what I'm trying to get at is I think we'll actually have better lives with a bit more gratitude and the more awareness of our surroundings as well, in my opinion. Um, so you've got experience as well in talking to like heads of schools and their responses. Could you go into more detail at all and unpick that about what sort of responses you've seen from the evidence?
Yeah, so I wrote an article for TEDS, for the Times Education Supplement, a couple of years ago, and it was on resilience. I've written quite a bit for them over the years, but I for me, one of the things I think that it's important in terms of a death in a school community, is that people need to be led. Okay, so it doesn't matter that I might feel terribly sad or, it might trigger things in me. That's not my job. My job is to lead people through those situations, and and hopefully along the way be sensitive and learn some things myself. But so I approached school leaders and I said, I'm going to write an article, and I'd be really interested to know if you've experienced any tragedies at school, if you like what impact that had on your school community. And I received a phenomenal amount of very personal, uh, privileged information, where people shared their innermost heartfelt thoughts on how the long-term impact of
Yeah.
those scenarios, and how one person talked about losing a child on a school trip, the child dying on a ski accident, um, how you then have to legislate for the trauma that the other children are experiencing, and the family back home who actually their child left and they were perfectly fine and then they never come home, and the media coverage, the media frenzy, and there was a consistent thread through a lot of the information they shared with me, these head teachers, which was that their own feelings were put on hold completely. They didn't allow themselves to think about stuff, because what they did was they placed clearly the needs of the family as paramount, and the pupils, and the teachers who take the trip, and all that kind of self-doubt, and what if I hadn't organized this and all of that, and could I have done this better and differently. And actually in that instance it was an accident, a tragic accident that
Mm.
had devastating consequences. But this particular head said that the teacher who organised the trip and was on the trip returned to school, and they did have a bereavement policy in place. And I referenced earlier that I'd done some work with the RAF, and actually the military have some very good policies, as you would know. And this particular individual had military training previously, and he said, I went for the handbook and I looked, and I cross-referenced all the different information and went with the thing I thought was best. But he said the teacher didn't exhibit what he would have anticipated as the usual signs of uh, grief. And then about 3 years later, that teacher had a nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
That was what was put on the form at the time, probably be more sensitively described now. But what they said was the teacher never returned to work after that point. And when the head went to visit the teacher said it was only then, all those years later, 3 years later, that they had allowed themselves to grieve,
Yeah.
because the enormity of the experience was so extreme,
Mm.
and they'd been all things to all people subsequently, that was the moment it kicked in. And the head said when he started to speak to the person, he realized that even though they brought in counseling for the staff and the pupils, and professionals were involved, he hadn't really explored his own grief.
Yeah.
And then he and that member of staff shared a lot at that point. And I think that's important to note, because it sort of tells me that the the thing we know, which is you can't put a time frame on any of this stuff.
No.
So, but I also had uh, a teacher who talked to me about a child who'd been shot in a tragic accident, um, and there was media coverage of it because uh, it was a family member. It was a total accident, but the press got hold of the story, and the teacher said no matter how much they had said to the school members, don't speak to the press, and they had the designated media lead. He said what they found was the press kind of were trying to talk to children and other families from the class, and it and how that head didn't have control over that.
Yeah. Yeah.
They communicated that the family would rather it didn't happen, but it nevertheless did occur. And these heads talked to me about the memorials that they did for the
Mm.
people who died, the children who died. They spoke about having like a table of flowers and a book, and people could write in it, but that there was a set time for that kind of thing, but that also people needed to importantly be told where that book then went if they wanted to add something afterwards. But then there was the more permanent reminder, the thing that the school community wanted and the family wanted. So whether it be a tree being planted or a picture being hung or something, that and where it was, and if it ever moved at a later point, where it went to, so
Yeah.
they would know. And then there were some sort of lessons learned, things they shared with me, things like families who donated the school uniform to the school
Mm.
for somebody in the second-hand uniform, and the importance of cutting out the labels on those clothes,
Okay.
sort of small things like that. But the heads across the board said, one, they didn't feel prepared, even though no matter how much training they'd had and how many policies they had. What they did, though, is feel that a framework of reference gave them the toolkit, to almost like a checklist,
Yeah.
to know where to start and to make sure they didn't miss the crucial stuff out, and to so for example, on CBUK website, they've got templates of letters that schools can use, and that's really beneficial because you don't always think of everything, and you can modify the templates, of course, but at least you're acknowledging that this is a professional framework others have followed, and it seems to
Yeah.
have been beneficial. Um, and they talked about things like whether it was appropriate to have professional counselling coming in immediately after a traumatic accident, or whether some time needed to pass. And explaining with teenage grief, explaining how the youngsters could feel different things at different times and not get angry with each other, that was a sign they didn't care as much. And with the younger children, talking to the families constantly about how they could support their young child at home. And many, of course, first-time parents and of that age bracket where they've probably not yet experienced a lot of grief
Yeah.
themselves, and reminding them about the significance of anniversaries,
Mm.
and that will be forevermore, and
Yeah. Yeah.
key events. And if you've lost, so we were saying earlier, 1 in 29 children have lost a significant adult kind of while still at school. So you think about that in every single class,
Mm.
somebody's experienced not just you know, death in general, but a significant
Yeah.
bereavement. And so I think from that point of view, we just have to remember that when that child A who is young and then they go to transition to senior school, there's someone who's not there to ask them about their first day, even though there might be a replacement person, they haven't replaced them totally. The engagement, the wedding, the first child, all of those things act as triggers, don't they? Or can
Yeah.
act as triggers.
Yeah.
And so for parents, one of the things we found was we did workshops for parents. So I ran the training for my staff. And then after that, the staff were involved in supporting the workshops for parents, which were optional. But we had a remarkable amount of people who attended.
Yeah.
And each of them said afterwards, wasn't one who didn't say thank you, because a bit like the disbelief thing, we hope it won't happen, but we know it will.
Mm.
And I think that leaves you to sort of the conclusion that it is necessary, the DFE lobbying and the work that you're doing around incorporating into personal social health education, really, really important, but also cross-curricular stuff. If
Yeah.
you're reading a book, there's that famous quote from To Kill a Mockingbird: you don't
Yeah.
really know someone until you've walked in their skin, walk in their shoes. And actually, sometimes it's easier for young people to read about a protagonist in a novel and the things they're going through, and then reflect and identify and acknowledge that they've maybe experienced some of those things too.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more with what you stated there. And just going back to the 1 in 29 will lose someone close to them in every classroom in the UK. But actually, what we didn't say really, what I haven't said, is that's 1 in 29 will suffer a close loss. But actually, what we saw when the Queen died, the nation was grieving. So how you measure a close loss is always going to be difficult. So it's every 22 minutes in the UK a parent dies, but actually someone's grandmother might be closer to them than their mother. So it's how you measure almost pain. So how you measure the success of education is always going to be difficult, but we just know how important this is.
The
And
other
also,
thing, John, I was sorry to interrupt, that I
yeah,
was going to say is we can't make presumptions about somebody else's relationship,
yeah,
because
yeah,
when someone dies, the child or any individual may not have had a good relationship with that person.
yeah,
And it may not be the worst thing that's ever happened to them,
mm,
but there are tricky things around that psychologically as well,
yes,
because I've encountered young people who had terrible relationships with one of their parents, and then the parent dies, and there's guilt in there, and
anger, yeah,
lots of anger and resentment, and you know, you were never there for me when you were alive, and now you've left me completely. And you know, I can remember a child saying that to me and being so angry. And instead of, again, trying to fix it, you know, what I learned was it was much better to allow them to own that feeling.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was quite legitimate to feel that way. And who am I to say, oh, you know, but maybe this and maybe that. That's how they felt,
You,
and it
you,
was important to know it.
yeah, you're so right. I've experienced before when for funeral services when actually there's been a really difficult relationship under terrible, extreme circumstances. But actually, witnessed the next of kin being at the crematorium, despite all this awful events that have happened in their life, and actually the grief coming out, and like you say, is a mixture of emotions, guilt, anger, relief, and then you have guilt from feeling relief. But it's really important that they have that opportunity, and actually that we don't judge because we don't know. And that's the thing with these cycles of grief and bereavement models. I have concerns around them because, like we said earlier on, it's not one size fits all. We're all individual. Our relationships are always individual, so therefore we can't simply provide a simple answer. But just being present, being present, listening, and giving people that space and compassion and care, I think it's starting us off in a really positive place. Um, and also, you mentioned about the Child Bereavement UK website. The letters are on there, templates are on there, and that's how I see my role in this. Really, is that all this stuff. People like yourself are out there doing amazing work. Child Bereavement UK have all the templates. There's other charities with lesson plans. There's schools not having any policies or plans in place. It's just that I want to connect it all up now. It's all out there.
Yeah, and that's why these podcasts are important,
Yeah,
because one person on their own can't make that difference, but
exactly.
collectively we can really have an impact. And you know, CBUK is a phenomenal charity, because some charities only deal with their own stuff, whereas CBUK are really good at signposting to others they think may do it differently, better, whatever. And I think that's really important. But I think it's also that we should be constantly learning and never presume. And teachers, you know, goodness knows they have enough to deal with every day. Teachers think that, you know, they don't know when they go into school what could happen during the course of the day, but no one prepares you for the significant impact that can happen with the death of a child in school. That, you know, and I've seen that firsthand, and it is just soul destroying. It's so sad.
Mm.
And you know, and we're never going to get it right. Some parents want you at the funeral, other parents don't. Some people want a bigger display and are inclusive in terms of children being in attendance. Other people don't want them anywhere near, and it's about being respectful of that. But it's also about afterwards, and you know, just simple things like the changes. You know, as a designated safeguarding lead for years, I've always known that an example of change is the significant factor. If a child becomes more withdrawn or very outrageously loud, or it's the change factor that's important. But I think it's also that children have so much to cope with after they've experienced death, that we've got to be mindful as schools and as parents that they're not going to be able to cope with the stuff they were able to cope with before, because they're on overload. So modifying homework, for example, is really, really important. But equally, balancing our expectations and saying, you know, you don't need to do that now, but I need you to be thinking, when do you think you will be able to do that? Because um, you hopefully know the child, someone knows that child enough to be able to work out whether they are taking advantage or it's a genuine concern. But I would say in the majority of interest, it's a genuine issue about information overload, not being able to concentrate, feeling anxious, feeling sad, and that homework is not the priority.
Mm,
So, and you know, if we can't get that, then I wonder sometimes whether, you know, we really need to rethink, because professionals go into teaching, as I said earlier, to make a difference.
yeah,
However small, you hope to make a difference.
yeah.
And um, yeah, and I think that's really, really important to acknowledge that we don't know everything.
Mm. No, well, Deborah, thank you so much. It's been fascinating to sort of unpick your mind on this. Someone who's um, got so much knowledge in this area and all your experiences. Just a huge thank you. And as I said right at the start, thank you for the work that you've done and continue to do. It's so important, and I hope I can play a small part as well in seeing these important conversations being connected and talked about throughout the UK. So, just a huge thank you from us all, and let's please stay in touch.
Thank you very much. I would finish by saying the more I do and the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know and
Hmm.
how much more I've got to learn. And I think that's why what you're doing is really, really important. And if I can help, if anyone wants us to reach out to me, then by all means, they can do so, because together we can make that difference.
Thanks, Deborah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.